Before the United States existed, before the word American carried any political or cultural meaning, this land was already full of people who lived on it, shaped it, defended it, and gave it meaning. There were territories with borders understood by those who lived there, societies governed by laws and traditions, economies based on trade, agriculture, and war. Indigenous nations had inhabited North America for thousands of years, forming complex civilizations with diplomacy, alliances, rivalries, and a profound relationship with the land itself. They did not arrive. They did not settle. They did not claim ownership in European terms. They belonged completely, unquestionably. To them, identity was not a passport or a document. It was memory, ancestry, and place. Then came the Europeans, arriving in waves across the Atlantic, not as Americans, but as extensions of empires. Spanish explorers, French traders, English colonists, Dutch merchants, all living on American soil while remaining mentally, culturally, and legally tied to distant capitals across the ocean. They did not see themselves as part of a new nation. They were subjects of kings, representatives of crowns, agents of old powers in a new world. For them, America was not an identity to embrace, but a space to exploit, control, and reshape. Colonies were built, towns expanded, borders shifted, yet loyalty never truly lived here. It lived in Europe. In this early era, people were physically present, but psychologically elsewhere. You could be born on American soil and still not be American, because that idea had not yet been invented. There was no shared national story, no collective we, no single definition of belonging. Identity was inherited from abroad, imposed from above, and fiercely guarded. The land was real, the people were real, the conflicts were real, but the nation was not. This is the first paradox of American history. A place crowded with residents long before it created citizens. A land overflowing with human life before it ever decided who truly counted as part of it. America existed in geography and struggle, but Americans, as an identity, were still waiting to be born. By the early 18th century, North America was no longer an empty frontier in European eyes. It was a patchwork of colonies, controlled by rival empires, each imposing its own laws, language, religion, and hierarchy. Millions of people lived in these territories, farmed the land, built cities, fought wars, and raised families, yet none of them were American. They were something else entirely. British subjects in the 13 colonies, Spanish vassals in Florida and the Southwest, French settlers along the Mississippi, Dutch traders clinging to commercial outposts. They shared the same continent, but not the same identity. Their status was defined not by where they lived, but by who ruled them. To be from America meant very little. What mattered was allegiance, the crown you served, the empire you belonged to. Living in America did not grant belonging, it simply placed you under authority. Even those born in the colonies inherited this condition. They spoke with different accents, practiced different faiths, followed different legal codes, yet all shared one thing. They were residents of America, but citizens of somewhere else. Power flowed outward, across the ocean, toward distant monarchs who would never see the land they governed. This created a strange and fragile society, rooted in American soil, but controlled by foreign decisions. Over time, tension grew between those who lived the reality of the land and those who ruled it from afar. Colonists began to sense the contradiction. They worked, paid, fought, and died in America, yet remained politically invisible. This was the birth of a silent fracture, one that would eventually reshape history. Long before the United States was founded, America was already full of people who lived there without owning it, who obeyed laws they did not create, and who belonged everywhere except the place they called home. These were the first true non-Americans, not foreigners, not immigrants, but residents of a land that had not yet decided who it was for. At the end of the 19th century, the United States entered a new phase of its history, one defined not by colonies or empires, but by mass arrival. Between the 1880s and the First World War, tens of millions of people crossed the Atlantic and the Pacific, stepping onto American soil through ports like Ellis Island. Italians, Irish, Germans, Poles, Jews from Eastern Europe, Scandinavians, and many others arrived with little more than luggage, hope, and exhaustion. Legally, many of them were allowed to stay. Culturally, few were welcomed. The country needed workers for factories, railroads, mines, and cities expanding at a brutal pace, but it did not yet know what to do with the people who would do that work. These newcomers were not immediately seen as future Americans. They were labeled as temporary, foreign, suspicious. Their languages, religions, clothing, and customs marked them as different in a society that was still unsure of its own identity. Newspapers warned that these arrivals would never assimilate. Politicians spoke of cultural dilution. Entire neighborhoods became symbols of otherness, even as they powered the American economy. For many immigrants, residency came quickly. Acceptance did not. Years passed, then decades. Children were born on American soil, spoke English without accents, and pledged allegiance to the flag, yet families were still seen as outsiders. The idea of being American remained selective, conditional, and fragile. Ellis Island, often remembered as a gateway to opportunity, was also a filter, not just of health or legality, but of belonging. It marked the beginning of an era in which millions lived in the United States, contributed to its growth, and obeyed its laws, while remaining socially separate from the identity they were supposedly joining. America was becoming powerful, industrial, and global, but at its core, it was still a nation learning how to turn residents into Americans, and often failing to do so. As the United States grew stronger, richer, and more confident, a crucial question emerged, one that would define its identity for generations. Who was actually allowed to become American? The answer was never simple, and it was rarely universal. From the very beginning, American identity was shaped not only by shared ideals, but by exclusion. The first naturalization laws made it clear that citizenship was selective, limited by race, origin, and social status. Being present in the country, working for it, or even being born, there was often not enough. Legal definitions drew invisible lines that separated those who could fully belong from those who could not. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, entire groups were classified as permanently foreign. Chinese laborers who helped build railroads were denied the possibility of naturalization. African Americans, even after emancipation, faced systemic barriers that treated citizenship as theoretical rather than real. Native Americans, whose presence predated the nation itself, were often excluded from citizenship entirely. American identity became something guarded, protected, and rationed. It was framed as a reward rather than a right, granted only to those who fit an idealized image of who an American was supposed to be. Laws reinforced social attitudes, and social attitudes reinforced the laws. Over time, this created a hierarchy of belonging, where some residents were encouraged to assimilate, while others were expected to remain on the margins indefinitely. The paradox deepened. The nation preached universal ideals while practicing selective inclusion. To live in the United States was one thing. To be recognized as American was another entirely. And in this gap between residency and recognition, a silent truth took shape. American identity was never just about loyalty or contribution, but about who the country decided was acceptable to fully claim it. By the 20th century, the United States liked to believe it had solved the question of belonging. The frontier was gone, the Constitution was old, and the nation presented itself as a finished project. But history had not ended. It had simply changed costumes. Each new wave of arrivals stepped into the same cycle their predecessors had faced decades earlier. They were welcomed as labor, tolerated as residents, and questioned as Americans. Italians, once dismissed as unfit, slowly blended into the mainstream. Irish immigrants, once viewed as dangerous outsiders, became symbols of urban political power. Groups that had been rejected in one generation were embraced in the next, not because the system changed, but because memory faded. Meanwhile, new communities took their place at the margins. The labels evolved, the accents changed, the neighborhoods shifted, but the logic remained the same. America continued to grow through the work of people it was not yet ready to fully accept. History shows a repeating rhythm: first arrival, then suspicion, then gradual normalization. The nation expands by relying on residents before redefining them as Americans. This pattern is not accidental, it is structural. American identity has always been elastic, stretching just enough to absorb the past while resisting the present. Every generation inherits a version of the same debate, convinced it is new, unaware it has already been lived. The country moves forward by rewriting its boundaries of belonging, slowly and unevenly. And in that slow motion, one historical truth becomes impossible to ignore. America is built in stages, by people who arrive as outsiders and are only later remembered as insiders. The past does not repeat itself exactly, but in the history of American identity, it rhymes with remarkable precision. The history of the United States does not end with a final definition of who is American. Unlike older nations built around ancestry, language, or bloodlines, America was constructed as an idea first and a people second. That choice gave it strength and permanent instability. From its earliest days, the country relied on residents to expand, defend, and enrich it, while hesitating to fully absorb them into its identity. This tension never disappeared. It simply became part of the system. Over centuries, laws changed, borders shifted, and definitions widened, yet the question of belonging remained unresolved. Each era believed it was closer to an answer, only to discover that identity moves more slowly than history. Being American was never a fixed state. It was a negotiation between past and present, between memory and reality. The nation learned to accept former outsiders by rewriting its own story, turning yesterday's strangers into today's founders. But this process was always selective, always incomplete. The United States continues to exist in this in-between space, strong because it adapts, fragile because it resists finality. In historical terms, this is not a flaw but a pattern. America was never meant to be finished. It was designed to remain in motion, constantly redefining who belongs within it. The residents who built it were not mistakes or exceptions. They were the mechanism itself. To understand American history is to accept this unfinished identity, a nation permanently becoming what it has never fully been.